The moment David Carter, a self-made billionaire and CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world, walked toward the first-class cabin of Aura Airlines Flight 762, he thought it would be just another routine business trip. But what happened next shattered every expectation he had, not just about air travel, but about the invisible walls still built around people like him. The flight attendant, clipboard in hand, blocked his path with a tight-lipped smile that failed to mask the judgment in her eyes. "Sir, you'll have to move to economy," she said, her tone carrying the subtle, poisonous edge of assumption. David froze, blinking in disbelief. He wasn't just any passenger. He was the CEO of a company worth billions, a philanthropist known for reshaping urban communities, and a man who had just flown internationally multiple times that month alone. Yet here he was, subtly and humiliatingly being told he didn't belong in the first-class cabin. Around him, passengers looked on, some uncomfortable, some indifferent. The air smelled of recycled fear, privilege, and entitlement. His heart pounded, not with anger alone, but with the bewildering shock of encountering blatant discrimination in 2025, at a time he thought the world was woke enough to know better. And then, as if in a cruel slow-motion movie scene, a wealthy-looking woman in the first-class lounge glanced at him, whispered to her companion, and laughed. The words were muffled but crystal clear in their intent. "He shouldn't be here." At that instant, David realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, a mistake, or a random act of human error. It was a deliberate systemic message encoded in manners and policies directed at him because of his skin color, no matter his title, wealth, or accomplishments. Every professional triumph, every accolade, every boardroom victory felt irrelevant under the harsh fluorescent lights of that cabin. And in that single, uncomfortable heartbeat, David made a decision. He wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about accountability, visibility, and exposing a rot that had festered behind the polite smiles of the airline industry for far too long. David Carter took a deep breath, the kind that feels like it might steady your body, but actually sets your nerves on fire. He looked the flight attendant straight in the eye, noting the slight quiver in her posture, whether from authority or the anticipation of conflict, he couldn't tell. "I think there's been a mistake," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of decades spent negotiating billion-dollar deals. "My ticket is first class, and I expect to be seated where I purchased my seat." The words should have been simple, routine even, but the way they hung in the recycled cabin air made them sound revolutionary, defiant. The attendant's smile stiffened into something sharper, thinner, like a blade masked as civility. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you again to move to economy," she replied, her tone deliberately casual, like she was enforcing a rule that somehow exempted everyone else in the cabin from being questioned. Around them, other passengers were now watching more intently. Some leaned slightly forward in curiosity. Others subtly shifted away, their discomfort palpable. A young woman in a business suit clutched her laptop bag to her chest, eyes wide, as if she had just stumbled into a silent, unspoken courtroom drama. David's pulse quickened, but he didn't back down. He knew this moment wasn't just about him, it was about every black professional who had been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they were out of place in spaces where they rightfully belonged. "Please call your manager," he said, now louder, more commanding. "I'd like someone in charge to explain why I'm being denied my seat despite my ticket confirmation." That request, simple and reasonable under any normal circumstance, seemed to shock the attendant. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if summoning reinforcements to deal with the audacity of a black man demanding basic decency in first class. Within moments, the purser approached, her professional facade tight and polished, but her eyes betrayed the judgment she had already formed before she had spoken a single word. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding," she said, almost apologetically. "We just need to verify your identification and ticket details." David handed over his passport and boarding confirmation, the elegant gold embossing on his business class ticket glaringly obvious. Yet the tension in the air made him feel as though he were presenting a child's scribbled drawing as evidence of entitlement. While the staff scurried to check databases and radio communications, whispers began to ripple through the cabin. "Did he get upgraded by mistake?" one passenger murmured. "I guess first class isn't for everyone," another whispered, the tone dripping with condescension. The murmurs grew louder, merging into a murky backdrop of judgment that seemed designed to isolate him in plain sight. But David refused to shrink. He observed quietly, noting the subtle microaggressions, the sideways glances, the barely concealed disdain in the eyes of some passengers who clearly believe that success and wealth should be defined by skin tone, as much as by bank balance. After what felt like an eternity compressed into 5 brutal minutes, the purser returned, holding a tablet in her hands. "Sir, it seems your ticket is valid," she said, her voice catching just slightly at the end, betraying an internal conflict she didn't bother to hide entirely. "We apologize for the confusion. You may be seated." Relief should have washed over David. Instead, it was a spark, a flash of recognition that this moment wasn't over. The apology, though formal, couldn't undo the humiliation, the whispered judgments, the way that invisible hierarchy had tried to push him down before grudgingly acknowledging his right to exist in that space. And then it happened. The same woman who had laughed earlier leaned over to her companion, sneering just enough for David to catch the words. Finally, they let him in. Ooh, that was the tipping point. It wasn't just the denial, the humiliation, or even the microaggressions. It was the audacity of those around him to treat him as if his presence was a threat to their comfort. David's hands clenched the armrests, but he didn't shout or escalate. Instead, he reached for his phone and began quietly documenting everything: the ticket, the boarding passes, the reactions, the whispers. He knew that in 2025, the power of social media was immediate, unflinching, and ruthless when wielded correctly. Within seconds, he began sending photos and brief notes to his assistant, instructing them to prepare a statement for both corporate and public channels. He didn't yet post anything, but the wheels were in motion. Around him, passengers continued to stare, some intrigued, some uncomfortable, and a few disgusted by the behavior of their peers. David realized in that moment that this wasn't just a personal battle, it was a public accountability issue, one that would expose Aurora Airlines for what it was: a company still entangled in outdated prejudices and blind entitlement, masquerading as civility. And as the engines roared, ready for takeoff, he made a mental note. The next 30 minutes would change everything. By the time the flight attendants cleared the last of the boarding paperwork, David Carter had already begun quietly typing on his phone. His hands moved swiftly, precise, almost surgical. Every photo, every short video clip, every subtle interaction, meticulously documented. He didn't need to embellish. Reality itself was damning enough. The initial screenshots of the ticket, the boarding pass, and the subtle yet unmistakable smirks of certain passengers formed a narrative that couldn't be ignored. Within minutes, he drafted a concise but cutting post on his verified social media account, clear, factual, and impossible to misinterpret. It described, step by step, how he had been denied his first-class seat despite a valid ticket, highlighting the evident racial bias in the attendants' actions, the purser's hesitations, and the whispers from other passengers. His post wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Every word hit like a spotlight, exposing the injustice that had unfolded in the confines of a cabin where millions of dollars of corporate wealth collided with the invisible barriers of prejudice. He uploaded it, attaching photos of the ticket and videos of the murmurs in the cabin, ensuring that the captions captured the essence of the humiliation without ever straying into hyperbole. And then he waited just a few seconds, which in the digital age felt like hours. Within moments, the notifications started to explode. Followers began to share, comment, and tag others, the story spreading like wildfire. The first reactions were a mix of shock and anger. How is this still happening? One comment read, "He's a CEO still treated like this?" Another post questioned, the outrage echoing the disbelief of millions who had long assumed that corporate status could immunize someone from blatant discrimination. By the time the plane doors were finally closed and the flight prepared for takeoff, David's post had gone viral. Hashtags like hashtag racism in airlines, hashtag CO denied, hashtag Aurora Airlines exposed, and hashtag first class for all were trending globally within the hour. Passengers on board began checking their own devices, some shocked that they were sitting amid what had now become a social media storm. Some whispered apologies, clearly uncomfortable that they had observed or participated in the subtle denigration. Others, however, remained oblivious, scrolling through feeds in stunned silence, unaware that the world outside this fuselage was reacting to a moment that had initially seemed private and contained. In the control tower, airline officials began to notice an unusual spike in mentions and alerts linked to Aurora Airlines. Within 10 minutes, multiple regional news networks picked up the story from social feeds, broadcasting headlines like Black CEO denied first-class airline under fire and Aurora Airlines faces accusations of systemic racism mid-flight. By this time, journalists were calling, reporters were live-streaming, and bloggers were dissecting every subtle interaction that had been captured, from the attendant's initial refusal to the whispers of fellow passengers. The airline's PR team, initially confident in controlling minor incidents, was now in full crisis mode. They scrambled to contact the captain, who was already preparing for takeoff, requesting details and clarification. Meanwhile, passengers began recording everything themselves, turning their devices toward the cabin's subtle drama, and uploading it to platforms with millions of viewers waiting for live updates. The digital explosion was immediate and uncontrollable. Within 20 minutes, international news outlets had begun framing the story, not just as a personal grievance, but as a wider commentary on racial discrimination in corporate and luxury spaces. Commentators analyzed the situation. Some criticized the airline for its staff training and policies. Others highlighted the broader societal implications, and social media influencers began amplifying the narrative, ensuring that Aurora Airlines' brand would face scrutiny across every continent. Amid the chaos, David remained composed, quietly observing the ripple effect of his documentation. He could see the power of social accountability in action, the speed at which truth, visual evidence, and reason could override carefully curated corporate narratives. And then came the calls from within the airline itself. Executives demanding to speak to him, legal teams preparing statements, and internal communications instructing staff to remain silent and professional. But David wasn't interested in private appeasements. He wanted transparency, he wanted accountability, and he wanted the story to reach every corner of the world that had previously assumed first-class entitlement was a neutral, unquestionable domain. By the time the plane was finally taxiing toward the runway, the hashtags had gained global traction. Trending lists in London, New York, Tokyo, and Johannesburg carried his name and the airlines in equal measure, igniting debates that would dominate news cycles for days. Passengers, now fully aware they were part of a viral story, watched with a mix of awe and discomfort as the ordinary routine of a flight became a catalyst for global social accountability. And in that moment, David Carter realized that his confrontation wasn't just a personal victory, it was the opening salvo of a broader reckoning for an industry that had long ignored the lived realities of marginalized passengers. Within minutes of the story going viral, Aurora Airlines' internal communications shifted into full emergency mode. The CEO of the airline, a man accustomed to smooth boardroom negotiations and strategic press releases, was now frantically pacing his office as phone lines rang off the hook. Legal counsel, PR teams, and regional managers were summoned simultaneously, each offering fragmented updates that only highlighted the chaos. "We need to control this before it spirals," one PR executive said, her voice tense, the kind of tension born from years of trying to clean up corporate mistakes that never should have happened. Meanwhile, the social media storm was relentless. Every post, tweet, and story about David Carter's experience was amplified by influencers, journalists, and outraged followers. Videos showing the subtle hesitation of the purser, the dismissive gestures of the flight attendants, and the whispered comments of fellow passengers circulated like wildfire, garnering millions of views within the first hour. Aurora Airlines attempted a conventional approach. An official statement claiming a procedural misunderstanding had occurred and that the company regretted any inconvenience caused. But the damage had already been done. The statement, a polished collection of corporate platitudes, did nothing to quell the outrage. If anything, it fueled the narrative that the airline was attempting to minimize what the public now recognized as a clear case of racial discrimination. At the airport, news crews had gathered outside the gates, reporting live as passengers and airline staff tried to maintain normal operations. Security personnel were instructed to prevent journalists from entering restricted areas, but the constant stream of live footage and eyewitness accounts from smartphones made containment impossible. Within 30 minutes, trending hashtags like hashtag Aurora Airlines fail, hashtag racism exposed, and hashtag CO stand up had taken over every major platform, drawing in viewers from around the globe. David Carter, meanwhile, remained calm yet deliberate in his actions. He was no longer a passenger simply fighting for a seat. He had become the face of accountability, the catalyst for a viral movement that would expose systemic bias across luxury travel industries. The airline's internal systems began to crumble. Under the pressure, flight attendants were called into meetings mid-flight via emergency communication lines. Managers debated whether to continue the flight, divert it, or ground it entirely. Calls from international media outlets demanded interviews with passengers, statements from airline executives, and official explanations for the apparent negligence and bias. On board, passengers felt the weight of the unfolding spectacle. Some, who had initially remained indifferent, now fidgeted nervously, realizing that their own reactions or lack thereof were part of the public record, documented in real time and broadcast to millions. A handful of passengers began speaking up, corroborating David's account, while others attempted to remain neutral, hoping to avoid viral exposure themselves. In the airline's control room, tension reached a fever pitch. Engineers, schedulers, and operations managers debated the unprecedented situation. The flight, which should have been routine, had transformed into a crisis scenario the likes of which had never been seen in commercial aviation. After intense deliberation, the airline's executives made a decision that would shock the industry. They ordered an immediate grounding of the flight. The announcement, though tactically sound from a legal and safety standpoint, was perceived as an admission of guilt by the public. Social media erupted even further. Videos of passengers disembarking, some still filming their surroundings, some visibly shaking from the stress of being part of a viral storm, spread worldwide. The hashtag airline grounded became instantly trending, with commentators and journalists dissecting every aspect of Aurora Airlines' failure from employee training to corporate culture. Airline stocks began to tumble in real time, reflecting not only investor panic but also public sentiment that was increasingly tied to moral and social accountability. Meanwhile, David remained composed, standing near his assigned seat but fully aware that the unfolding chaos was far bigger than himself. He had anticipated that exposing injustice would provoke reactions, but the scale and speed of the global response were staggering even for someone accustomed to high-stakes environments. And as the plane emptied under the scrutiny of cameras, tweets, and live streams, David recognized a pivotal truth. Moments like these were not simply about confrontation, they were about transformation. The airline, the passengers, and even bystanders across social media were now participating in a reckoning that would not be easily forgotten. A system that had allowed subtle discrimination to thrive for decades was being forced into the light, all because one man refused to accept a lie cloaked in civility. By the time the last passenger stepped off the grounded flight, Aurora Airlines was no longer just an airline, it was a case study in accountability, viral exposure, and the extraordinary consequences of underestimating the power of truth in the digital age. The story had shifted from personal grievance to societal wake-up call, setting the stage for repercussions that would ripple far beyond a single flight, reaching executives, employees, regulators, and consumers around the world. The moment Aurora Airlines announced the grounding of Flight 762, the situation escalated from a viral social media storm to a full-blown corporate crisis. Within minutes, Legal teams from both the airline and David Carter's company were on. Emergency conference calls, analyzing liabilities, drafting statements, and assessing the potential fallout. David, ever strategic, had already anticipated this moment. He knew that a public confrontation alone would not be enough to drive lasting change. The power of accountability would come from legal scrutiny, regulatory pressure, and the undeniable evidence captured during the incident. His assistant, monitoring global media, reported that news networks in Europe, North America, Asia, and Africa had picked up the story. Headlines blared across screens. Black CEO denied first-class seat. Airline grounded amid racial bias accusations. Aurora Airlines faces unprecedented social media outrage, and luxury airlines. Racism scandal sparks global debate. The narrative was no longer about a single man's humiliation. It had transformed into a global conversation about systemic bias in travel, corporate accountability, and the moral obligations of private companies operating in public spaces. Airline executives, meanwhile, were in full damage control mode. Emergency meetings convened in conference rooms around the world. The CEO of Aurora Airlines, visibly tense, addressed the board with a mixture of disbelief and panic. "We are facing something unprecedented," he admitted. "Our social media platforms are flooded, regulators are calling. Investors are panicking. This is no longer just about a single passenger, it's a global indictment of our corporate culture." Across the airline's operations centers, employees grappled with the fallout. Flight attendants, purser staff, and managers were placed on mandatory virtual meetings, reviewing scripts for media interactions and instructed on legal obligations under anti-discrimination laws. But no amount of internal training could undo what had already been broadcast to millions of viewers. In the control tower, communications with regulators escalated. Aviation authorities demanded detailed reports on the incident, including staff statements, security footage, and passenger accounts. A preliminary inquiry was launched, and auditors were dispatched to review both the airline's internal procedures and the documented behavior of the crew. Meanwhile, legal teams working for David prepared a formal complaint citing racial discrimination, emotional distress, and violations of passenger rights. Every recorded interaction, the hesitant purser, the dismissive flight attendant, the whispers of other passengers, was cataloged meticulously, forming a robust case that left little room for ambiguity. In press conferences that followed, David's team emphasized the broader significance of the incident. "This isn't just about a seat or a ticket," a spokesperson stated. "It's about the normalization of discrimination in spaces that are supposed to reflect equality, professionalism, and dignity." Companies like Aurora Airlines have a responsibility not only to their shareholders but to the public. This event demonstrates the consequences of failing to uphold that responsibility. Social media continued to amplify the story. Influencers created videos analyzing the timeline, dissecting passenger reactions, and highlighting how subtle behaviors can perpetuate systemic bias. Hashtags like #accountability in airlines and #equity in travel soared in trending rankings, sparking online discussions among users from all walks of life. Influencers encouraged their followers to document their own experiences with discrimination in travel, turning David's story into a viral movement that challenged entrenched corporate practices. The pressure on Aurora Airlines intensified as international regulators weighed in. Civil aviation authorities demanded formal explanations of crew training, operational protocols, and complaint handling procedures. Consumer advocacy groups launched petitions calling for audits of the airline's hiring and training practices. Investors, alarmed by potential long-term reputational damage, began questioning the leadership in board meetings, scrutinizing management. Decisions that had allowed such an incident to escalate unchecked. Within the airline itself, the culture of fear and accountability clashed. Employees who had once ignored microaggressions now feared public exposure. Some openly criticized management decisions in private messages that inevitably leaked online. The airline's internal communications became a minefield of contradictory reports, panic-driven directives, and urgent crisis mitigation attempts. For David, however, the chaos around him only reinforced his resolve. He maintained a composed demeanor, knowing that patience and strategy were as crucial as the initial documentation of the incident. While the airline scrambled to contain the viral spread, he had already begun outlining steps to ensure systemic changes. Meetings with civil rights organizations, legal teams, and policy advocates were scheduled to follow, aiming to create a ripple effect that would extend beyond a single company or industry. The public, meanwhile, remained riveted. Memes, analytical breakdowns, and live reaction videos flooded feeds, each post reinforcing the narrative that a billionaire CEO could still be denied basic respect due to the color of his skin. Journalists traveled to the airport, interviewing passengers who corroborated David's experience. First-hand accounts described how whispers, sidelong glances, and subtle gestures of exclusion had made the cabin feel hostile, despite outward appearances of politeness. The airline's attempts at apology seemed performative in comparison, further fueling outrage. Within hours, regulatory agencies announced an official investigation into Aurora Airlines practices, focusing not only on the incident with David Carter, but also on broader claims of systemic discrimination reported by other passengers in previous years. Analysts speculated that the airline could face fines, legal settlements, and mandates for comprehensive staff retraining. Public pressure intensified when advocacy organizations encouraged boycotts, urging travelers to avoid Aurora Airlines until the company demonstrated genuine reform. On social media, users highlighted alternative airlines with better reputations for equality, creating an immediate impact on Aurora's bookings. The financial consequences were tangible. Share prices dropped, stockholders demanded emergency meetings, and top executives faced mounting criticism for failing to anticipate the reputational risks of the incident. Meanwhile, David Carter became the central figure in a larger societal conversation. His response was widely praised as measured, strategic, and unflinchingly committed to justice. By refusing to allow the incident to be dismissed as a minor misunderstanding, he had transformed a personal grievance into a viral catalyst for accountability. The story now extended beyond aviation, prompting discussions about how systemic bias operates in corporate environments, luxury spaces, and institutions that present themselves as neutral or meritocratic. What had started as a single flight denial had evolved into a landmark case with far-reaching implications. And as the airline scrambled to manage the fallout, regulators, journalists, and the public all waited for the next chapter in the unprecedented story that David Carter had ignited, an incident that had begun with a single seat but now demanded structural change, transparency, and a reckoning that would not be forgotten. As the hours passed after the viral exposure of Aurora Airlines Flight 762, the repercussions began to hit the airline in ways no boardroom simulation could have prepared them for. News channels across multiple continents ran continuous coverage, showing footage of David Carter's confrontation, the grounded plane, and interviews with passengers who had documented the subtle but unmistakable bias they witnessed in real time. The airline's official statements, once carefully curated to minimize fallout, now seemed hollow and inadequate in comparison to the flood of evidence circulating online. Each new social media post or live-stream video amplified public outrage, turning what might have been an isolated incident into a global reckoning on systemic discrimination within luxury air travel. The airline stock tumbled precipitously as investors panicked over the unprecedented viral backlash, fearing long-term reputational damage and potential legal consequences. Corporate leaders scrambled to convene emergency board meetings, their voices tense and panicked as they assessed both financial and social liability. The CEO of Aurora Airlines, once confident in his ability to manage crises, now faced an impossible challenge, containing a story that had already escaped all control. Within the first 12 hours after the viral post, calls from regulators, politicians, and civil rights organizations flooded the airline's offices. Aviation authorities demanded detailed reports on crew training procedures, complaint protocols, and documented passenger grievances. Civil rights groups, legal advocacy organizations, and social justice coalitions coordinated online campaigns, pressuring the airline to take immediate corrective action. Petitions circulated worldwide calling for top-level accountability and mandatory systemic reforms within Aurora Airlines. The airline's executives quickly realized that the incident could not be mitigated by conventional PR tactics alone. The global scrutiny required decisive, visible action. In emergency board sessions, the conversation shifted from damage control to accountability. The CEO and several high-ranking executives faced intense criticism from both internal and external stakeholders. The board concluded that leadership change was unavoidable. Within 24 hours, a public statement announced the resignation of the airline CEO, the purser involved in the incident, and multiple mid-level managers responsible for staff training and passenger engagement. The resignations were framed as a necessary step toward rebuilding trust with the public, but for observers worldwide, they represented the consequences of systemic negligence and the undeniable power of social accountability in the digital age. Meanwhile, David Carter's influence continued to grow. Interviews, panel discussions, and social media interactions positioned him as a central figure in the ongoing conversation about equity and justice in corporate spaces. Rather than seeking retribution alone, David emphasized structural change, advocating for policies that would prevent future discrimination, ensuring that no passenger, regardless of race, gender, or social status, would ever face similar humiliation. In the airline's internal communications, employees expressed a mix of shock, relief, and fear. Flight attendants, purser staff, and managers were suddenly aware that even subtle biases and microaggressions could have global ramifications. The company instituted mandatory retraining sessions emphasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, while external auditors were hired to review hiring, training, and customer service procedures. The ripple effect extended beyond Aurora Airlines. Competing carriers, concerned about reputational risk, preemptively reviewed their own policies and staff training programs. Consultants were brought in to ensure that any potential biases in passenger treatment could be identified and mitigated. Within days, industry-wide discussions emerged in forums, conferences, and international aviation summits, highlighting the Aurora Airlines incident as a watershed moment in corporate accountability. Social media continued to serve as a platform for ongoing discussion. Millions of users shared personal stories of discrimination in travel, hospitality, and corporate spaces, reinforcing the broader societal context of the viral story. Influencers, journalists, and activists coordinated campaigns encouraging transparency, systemic reform, and the amplification of marginalized voices. David Carter remained at the center of the movement, using his platform not for self-promotion, but to demand actionable change. He met with regulatory authorities, corporate leaders, and advocacy groups, ensuring that the incident would result in measurable improvements in airline policies and training standards. The airline's financial repercussions were immediate and stark. Stockholders called for emergency meetings to assess the damage, executives resigned or were dismissed, and bookings plummeted as travelers opted for competitors with better reputations. For equity and customer service, insurance companies reviewed liability policies, legal teams anticipated lawsuits, and aviation authorities prepared inquiries that would last for months. The crisis also prompted widespread media coverage highlighting similar incidents in other industries, creating a chain reaction of public awareness and corporate accountability. Even as the airline attempted to issue formal apologies and promises of reform, the viral nature of the incident ensured that the story remained in the public consciousness for weeks. News networks followed up with investigative reports interviewing passengers, former employees, and industry experts. Each new piece of coverage reinforced the narrative of systemic negligence and highlighted the unprecedented speed with which social media could hold corporations accountable. Internally, Aurora Airlines underwent a complete operational overhaul. Human Resources implemented new reporting mechanisms for passengers and employees, emphasizing anonymous reporting and third-party oversight. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Offices were given authority to review operational practices and directly report to the board of directors. Training programs were redesigned to address unconscious bias, microaggressions, and culturally competent customer service. Executives recognized that rebuilding trust would require sustained commitment, transparency, and measurable results. Globally, David Carter's experience became a case study for leadership, corporate responsibility, and the influence of social media in enforcing accountability. Universities, business schools, and corporate training programs analyzed the incident, emphasizing the lessons learned, the importance of vigilance against bias, the power of documentation, and the necessity of ethical leadership in moments of conflict. The story of Flight 762 was cited as an example of how one individual, armed with evidence, strategy, and courage, could ignite systemic change within a multinational corporation. Even weeks after the incident, discussions persisted on social media, news outlets, and within corporate boardrooms. Aurora Airlines restructuring, policy reforms, and leadership changes became a reference point for other organizations seeking to avoid similar reputational crises. David Carter, though a central figure in the viral narrative, consistently emphasized that the ultimate goal was systemic reform rather than personal victory. The incident catalyzed a broader movement, inspiring passengers, employees, and corporate leaders alike to confront implicit biases, demand accountability, and ensure equity in spaces traditionally dominated by entrenched privilege. By the end of the week, the airline had publicly committed to long-term structural reforms, including external oversight, comprehensive retraining, and revised customer service protocols. Analysts hailed the story as a turning point in corporate accountability, illustrating the unprecedented power of social media and the global demand for equity in professional and consumer spaces. For David, the victory was not in the resignations or the viral headlines, but in the tangible changes set in motion. A safer, fairer environment for every passenger, and a reminder that even powerful institutions could be held accountable when truth and justice intersected with courage and strategic action. In the days following the Flight 762 incident, Aurora Airlines was forced to confront the full scope of the damage not just financially, but socially, legally, and culturally. The airline's board of directors held emergency sessions daily, coordinating with PR teams, legal counsel, and regulatory authorities to navigate a crisis that had grown far beyond any precedent in commercial aviation. On social media, the story continued to dominate headlines, trending hashtags reinforcing the airline's accountability struggle. Hashtag Aurora Airlines Reckoning, hashtag Flight 762, hashtag Equity Air Travel, and hashtag CEO Exposes Racism were seen on every platform from Twitter and Instagram to LinkedIn and TikTok. Passengers, journalists, and influencers kept the story alive, sharing first-hand accounts and dissecting corporate statements. David Carter's post, which had started as documentation of an individual grievance, now served as a blueprint for exposing systemic inequities. He remained measured in his communications, emphasizing that this was not about personal vindication, but about ensuring structural changes that would prevent future discrimination. The airline's response evolved in real time. Within 72 hours of the viral post, Aurora Airlines issued a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The statement detailed the resignation of key executives, the initiation of a comprehensive internal review, and the immediate implementation of anti-discrimination training for all staff. This time, however, the communication went beyond corporate platitudes. Independent auditors were brought in to validate the changes, external observers were granted access to training programs, and a hotline was established for passengers to report discriminatory incidents without fear of retaliation. The airline's leadership understood that mere words were insufficient. Global audiences demanded action, transparency, and measurable accountability. Regulators commended the airline's decision to engage external oversight but emphasized that oversight alone would not resolve systemic issues. Investigations continued into the airline's internal culture, policies, and prior complaints from passengers who had allegedly experienced discrimination. The media covered every development, interviewing experts on racial equity, corporate ethics, and customer rights. Social commentators framed the incident as a turning point, highlighting the intersection of social media, corporate accountability, and racial justice in contemporary society. Within the company, employees were visibly affected by the unfolding scrutiny. Flight attendants, managers, and operational staff participated in intensive training sessions focused not only on anti-discrimination measures but also on fostering inclusive environments. The atmosphere was tense yet transformative, with employees recognizing the tangible consequences of bias and microaggressions in a digital age, where private behavior could instantly become public knowledge. Across the industry, competitors took notice. Other airlines preemptively reviewed their internal policies, fearing that similar incidents could spark backlash. Conferences, webinars, and corporate training programs increasingly incorporated case studies based on Flight 762, reinforcing the need for vigilance, transparency, and equitable treatment of all passengers. Meanwhile, David Carter's influence expanded beyond the airline. He was invited to speak on panels about systemic bias in corporate spaces, appeared in interviews discussing the power of social media in enforcing accountability, and collaborated with advocacy groups to develop frameworks for equitable customer service. His measured approach, combining evidence, strategy, and advocacy, was widely praised as a model for confronting injustice without resorting to public confrontation for its own sake. For the passengers on Flight 762, the experience remained unforgettable. Some were empowered to share their own experiences of discrimination, while others reflected on their complicity in silent judgment or inaction. The viral coverage ensured that these accounts were amplified globally, reinforcing the narrative that systemic bias is not just a personal issue but a societal one that demands collective accountability. The airline's public acknowledgement and reforms were the first visible signs of change, but the ripple effects extended further. Investors demanded ongoing updates on the implementation of policies. Regulators monitored compliance, and social media users continued to track progress, ensuring that promises of reform were backed by tangible action. The story had shifted from an isolated act of bias to a comprehensive examination of corporate responsibility, societal expectations, and the power dynamics that shape access, privilege, and equality in modern industries. And through it all, David Carter remained composed, strategic, and forward-looking. He understood that true accountability required vigilance over time, not a one-time viral post. By documenting the incident, engaging regulatory authorities, and amplifying the public discourse on equity, he had catalyzed a movement that extended far beyond his personal experience. Flight 762, which had begun as a routine journey, had become an enduring case study on the consequences of prejudice, the power of social media, and the capacity of individuals to drive systemic change. Aurora Airlines, humbled and under intense scrutiny, had no choice but to implement reforms that would affect operations, culture, and policy for years to come. The incident had proven that no corporation, regardless of size or wealth, could ignore the demands of justice when exposed. In the court of public opinion, in the weeks following the Flight 762 incident, the world watched as Aurora Airlines transformed from a symbol of unchecked privilege and systemic bias into a case study of accountability, reform, and public pressure. The airline, once defensive and reactive, now publicly committed to long-term cultural and structural changes that would redefine its operations, training, and customer engagement. Independent auditors monitored the company's implementation of anti-discrimination programs, diversity initiatives, and complaint resolution procedures, ensuring that promises translated into tangible outcomes rather than empty statements. Regulators maintained oversight, while civil rights organizations collaborated with the airline to create permanent mechanisms for passenger protection, making Flight 762 a benchmark for equitable treatment across the aviation industry. Social media, which had initially exposed the incident, now documented the progress, holding the airline accountable in real time. Hashtags like #Flight762Legacy, #Equity in Airlines, and #Change in the Skies continued trending, not only keeping the story alive but serving as an ongoing reminder to corporations that transparency and ethical behavior could no longer be optional. The broader impact rippled beyond Aurora Airlines. Other carriers preemptively examined their internal practices, staff training, and complaint handling procedures to avoid similar public backlash. The story became a global lesson in corporate ethics, a case study cited in business schools, leadership seminars, and diversity workshops worldwide. By turning a personal humiliation into a viral movement for systemic reform, David Carter demonstrated the power of strategic action, documentation, and moral courage in holding institutions accountable. His reputation as a leader extended far beyond business acumen. He became a symbol of justice, integrity, and the ability to leverage influence for societal change. Meanwhile, the passengers of Flight 762 carried their experiences forward, sharing their observations in media interviews, podcasts, and social platforms, emphasizing that vigilance against bias required both individual courage and collective accountability. The airline's employees, who had witnessed the viral storm firsthand, experienced a profound shift in corporate culture. Training programs, mentorship initiatives, and accountability systems instilled a heightened awareness of equity and inclusion, ensuring that discrimination, even subtle, systemic, or unconscious, was identified, addressed, and prevented. Aurora Airlines' financial performance eventually stabilized, but the story's legacy persisted. The incident remained a touchstone in discussions of privilege, systemic bias, and corporate responsibility. Executives, shareholders, and employees alike recognized that reputation in the digital age was inextricably tied to ethical conduct, transparency, and social accountability. For David Carter, the resolution was both personal and societal. While the initial denial of his first-class seat had been humiliating and infuriating, it ultimately catalyzed a global reckoning that reshaped an industry. He had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, ensuring that future passengers, regardless of race, wealth, or status, would be treated with dignity and respect. Flight 762 became more than a viral headline. It became a landmark moment, demonstrating the extraordinary consequences of standing up against systemic discrimination. The airline, humbled and transformed, now operated under new scrutiny, improved policies, and a culture that could no longer ignore the moral imperative of equity. Social media continued to serve as both a record and a tool for accountability, reminding corporations and individuals alike that injustice, when documented and amplified, cannot remain hidden. David Carter's name became synonymous with courage, strategic advocacy, and the power of one individual to create ripple effects that extend far beyond personal experience. The story concluded not with simple vindication, but with lasting transformation, a grounded flight that sparked a worldwide conversation, forced institutional change, and left a permanent imprint on corporate culture, social responsibility, and the collective consciousness. Flight 762 would forever be remembered, not for the turbulence of the sky, but for the upheaval of an entire system, proving that when truth meets courage, the world takes notice, and justice, even when delayed, becomes inevitable. As the dust settled and Flight 762 became a case study referenced around the world, the legacy of that single denied first-class seat continued to ripple far beyond the airline, far beyond the passengers on that plane, and far beyond even David Carter himself. The incident had illuminated the insidious ways bias operates in seemingly invisible corners of everyday life, showing that wealth status or corporate power cannot shield someone from discrimination. Aurora Airlines, now under the scrutiny of regulators, media, and global audiences, had transformed its culture, instituted policies to prevent bias, and trained every employee to recognize and address inequities proactively. The story also sparked a broader conversation in society. Executives, travelers, and ordinary citizens alike began to examine how unconscious bias manifests in workplaces, schools, and public spaces, fostering a renewed dialogue on equity and accountability. David Carter, who had initially faced humiliation and disbelief, emerged not only as a champion of justice, but as a symbol of what courage, strategy, and meticulous documentation can achieve in the digital age. His actions demonstrated that one person, armed with truth and resolve, can ignite a movement, force institutional reform, and shift global perception. Social media, which had erupted in outrage in those first frantic hours, evolved into a platform for reflection, education, and advocacy, showing the world the power of transparency and collective vigilance. Flight 762 would forever remain emblematic of how injustice, when confronted decisively and ethically, can become the catalyst for systemic change. It reminded corporations, regulators, and everyday citizens alike that no act of discrimination exists in isolation, that microaggressions and overt prejudice alike have consequences, and that accountability is not optional in a connected digital world. The passengers who bore witness, the employees who learned, the airline that restructured, and the global audience that engaged all became part of a story that would echo for years, teaching lessons of dignity, resilience, and responsibility. In the end, what began as a moment of personal humiliation transformed into a universal lesson in justice, that standing up to inequality, documenting truth, and demanding accountability can topple assumptions, reshape institutions, and leave an enduring mark on history. Flight 762 was no longer just a flight. It had become a symbol, a turning point, and a reminder that courage and integrity have the power to change not just a company but the world. And as David Carter looked back on the events, he understood that the greatest victories are not measured by personal triumph, but by the lives they touch, the injustices they prevent, and the change they inspire.